Hello, memoir and writers. I am Grant Faulkner at Memoir Nation, and I'm happy to say that Pro Writing Aid is now sponsoring this podcast. And I'm happy about that because I have used Pro Writing Aid, both as a grammar checker, but more importantly, as a tool to help me structure and probe questions in my book. And the main tool I have used is their manuscript analysis tool. It provides full manuscript developmental feedback in minutes. And to tell you the truth, I was initially dubious of it, but when I used it, it helped me uncover plot holes and think about different structural possibilities and see how my pacing worked. And I liked it because it was kind of like a beta reader because it opened up questions for me to consider. But I want to emphasize not solutions, just questions. And it made me more aware of some story elements to consider. So I essentially emerged from that analysis with a revision plan in hand. Just so you know, Pro Writing Aid's goal is not to automate storytelling. It's to make the process of writing richer and more empowering by opening up questions to consider your writing. Also, many of Pro Writing Aid's competitors support only one part of the writing process, but Pro Writing Aid has tools to help writers, from the first spark of inspiration to the polished draft. And it really is focused on creative writing, not business writing and stuff like that. So here's the dramatic ending. We have an exclusive discount for you. If you type in memoir, all caps memoir, to the promo code box on the purchase page, you'll get 20% off all annual subscription plans. So I encourage you to type in memoir when you sign up for Pro Writing Aid and get 20% off, and write and revise, write and revise, write and revise. Thank you, Memoir Nation listeners.
Hello, intuitors, channelers, inhabitors, and embodiers. I am Brooke Warner here as always with my co-host Grant Faulkner. And Grant, we have a very interesting episode today. And part of that is because of who our guest is, Brandon Deyette. And, we get pitches, of course. We go after guests, and sometimes people reach out to us. In Brandon's case, he pitched us, his publicist pitched us, and it really caught my eye because he wanted to talk about this idea of writing in another person's voice. And at first I thought, yeah, it's going to be a show about ghostwriting. But the more I looked into his background and the more I understood what he was doing, I discovered that actually what he's doing is not exactly ghostwriting, and that it's almost like channeling what he does. And so what do you think?
What do I think? Many things. You did this very unusual screening process with Brandon. It was quite unique to our general process because you decided you wanted to talk to him to see if what he does is applicable to other writers. And I even thought that while we were interviewing him. I think it is applicable. I think it's really fascinating. So yeah, I feel like the verdict is, well, it's kind of yes and no on that, but say more about what you found out when you two talked, because it's definitely a unique approach. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. I mean, the most interesting thing that Brandon talked about was how he's able to go into this trance-like state while he is experiencing the emotions of the experiences of the writers that he's collaborating with. Obviously, that is unusual. I don't think that most people go into trance-like states. And maybe it's not a totally transferable skill, but I do think the way that he talks about experiencing emotion, and there's something about like an experience trying to capture pure and true emotion when you are writing, I think, expressly, explicitly memoir, that is fundamentally important to the experience of writing memoir in the first place, because a lot of us are starting with our head, getting very locked into our heads. I work with tons of people who just simply can't access their emotions at all, and after talking to him, I was like, yeah, I just want to also have this space to talk about like, how do we access our emotions? Even if Brandon's particular experience falls into, what we might call kind of an extreme state.
Definitely an extreme state. It's definitely different than a flow state. It's trance writing, but it's also fascinating. And one of the fascinating things Brandon shared with you is, about his background, that his mom suggested that he get into theater to better understand, social interactions and human emotions after he was diagnosed basically as neurodivergent, that wasn't the word they used at the time. And theater seems to have unlocked for him a whole new world of emotions and experiences that led him to character study and eventually to writing. And he told us via email, he wrote, "This interplay between the theatrical sinking into my own emotions and the cerebral formulating someone else's voice became my well for for expression and the embodiment of all of my characters. And that pretty much sums up our conversation today. And I actually really love that. And I agree that maybe we can all learn something from this about, what it takes to fully sink into our own emotions. I know I feel often that I'm skating on the surface, but we need to be very intentional to get deeper because, it doesn't really matter if you're writing your own story or someone else's when it comes to emotion. We can be as disconnected from our own emotions as we are from a stranger's. And dissociation is not uncommon when it comes to memoir writing. So Brandon seemed to have learned how to go into this alternate state of sorts with his writing. And he actually gets deeply into that process, which I also found interesting. So yeah, but it made me wonder, Brooke, have you ever experienced anything like this yourself? Meaning trance writing, whether with your writing or maybe another activity?
Yeah, not with writing, I have to say, but I am jealous.
Yeah, I'm totally jealous.
I would really like to reach that state with my writing. I mean, Brandon talks about drowning out any thoughts and all senses. I mean, in the interview, he even talked about nearly blacking out, pouring himself into the emotions when he goes into this meditative trance. And, that's where he conjures up that person's story and then he mixes it with emotions. I was thinking to myself, he's basically an alchemist. So I have not. I kind of want to try. I was thinking and it was one of the reasons too that I wanted to bring him on because what would happen if we drown out all the senses? I have been in a sensory deprivation tank and that kind of thing of floating in water with no other feeling around. I definitely had some pretty powerful, almost lucid dreams. And I also have put on loud music, especially on airplanes, because I'm trying to drown out everything. And I have been able to write in that state, to think in that state. And so this idea of turning on music and going straight to the writings and your instincts taking over, I think that's fairly common. And then I was going to say, when I run, I have definitely hit meditative trance in my running, especially long distance. And I think that's just about the rhythm of breathing and monotony and one foot in front of the other and losing track of time. And so I guess, as I'm talking, it's these states are not as elusive as we might think, but most of us aren't really trying to cultivate them actively, I think.
It is. And he even went away, to a hotel room for 2 weeks and really went deep with it, which I thought was interesting. But I really like your analogy of running. I remember when I first came across the concept of the runner's high, and this was when I was just beginning to run long distance. When I honestly, I think I was 8 or 10 years old. I was just so attracted to running long distances and trying to reach that runner's high. And there's definitely something there about getting to this state where your whole sense of life around you is just so different. And you can, you run to the point of exhaustion, which it becomes kind of seductive. But I think I initially thought of this as more like a flow state. And I think all of us can reach flow states. But again, we do have to be kind of intentional about it sometimes. But when I am in that state, I'm not only more in touch with myself, but I'm also just more in touch with characters on the page. And I've heard many authors say that they reach a stage where the characters are telling them the story. And I can definitely feel that at times just because I become less in control. And I actually wrote a Substack newsletter about this, about the concept of surrender, surrender in general, but also surrender on the page. And it was inspired by the musician Brian Eno, who said that surrender is an action verb. And I aspire to that when I write, certainly. And I also have a friend who, it's interesting to me because she's maybe a little bit more like Brandon because she writes through a persona, and that's more than just a pseudonym. She does inhabit this persona, this other person. And I know that she often talks about how she's channeling the story, that her persona is really guiding her pen pretty much.
Interesting. Yeah. And I don't think it's uncommon, right? That's the part of the allure of the topic. And it is, like you said, it's a bridge to what Brandon does that I find so compelling for memoir writers specifically. And when you think about it, Grant, as I was just preparing for the interview, I was we're actually always writing in another's voice. It's the voice of the past you when you're writing memoir. It's someone you used to be. And when I think of myself at age 15 or 21 or even 30, I'm kind of a stranger to that person that I was, right? And in the writing, I really have to conjure her back. And so there's this, common experience that we all have memoir writing that I think we can apply Brandon's experience and techniques, just to be like, okay, we are channeling this voice and we do know that person well. We've lived their life, but we're not them anymore.
That's a really profound reframe, I think. And in memoir writing, there's just always that interplay between the two narrators, the narrator who's in scene, re-experiencing something, and the narrator who's at a distance, making sense of things. So to write that experiencing self truthfully, you basically do have to channel it. You have to get out of your present self's way.
Yeah, that thing of getting out of the way, right, it's not easy because so many people want to always like sit there and be like, well, this is why I understand something and this is what I know now. And, I think the reality is that experiencing narrator for people, when you go back in time and you experience something, especially if it's traumatic or difficult, it's destabilizing. You're not just remembering, you're actually inhabiting, which is again like what Brandon is doing, right? Inhabiting someone else's experience. And then for some writers, that descent into old memories and ways of being is really hard to visit in the first place, but it's also actually hard to come out of. And so some people are more resilient in that process, some people less so. But I do think memoir is such an emotional roller coaster, and we do talk about it, but maybe we don't talk about it enough, which is why I think that this whole conversation around emotion and memoir and how we enter into it is so powerful. And it's why I wanted to bring Brandon on the show. I just wanted to explore this and also just wonder to myself, like, is there a practice in this?
Well, the question I'm walking into this interview with is whether, what Brandon does, is a capacity that can be cultivated, or is he just wired differently, or both? And even if he is wired differently, yeah, I think he's likely both. But even if he is wired differently, I think there's a lot to learn about the very possibility of changing up our writing practice and knowing that we don't do it all the same way. That was what was fascinating to me, is just how different his process was than mine, and that he does that very intentionally to tap into new realms of emotion, both past and present. So this is super rich territory. So I'm looking forward to delving into it with Brandon after this very, very, very short break.
Welcome back, everyone. We have Brandon Deyette on the podcast with us today. And Brandon is a writer, a co-author, and an award-winning filmmaker whose work centers on translating lived experiences into deeply resonant narratives. And this matters for the subject that we're going to be talking about today. He is the co-author of Young is Blessed, a memoir written alongside Young Bae, who is a tattoo artist, entrepreneur, and star of VH1's Black Ink Crew. And this is a story that chronicles her journey from an abusive childhood in South Korea to becoming a celebrated entrepreneur and TV personality. So Brandon and Young had known each other for a long time, and through a lot of close years of friendship, Brandon approached writing with her not so much as a ghostwriter gathering facts, but as a collaborator conducting a complete character study, which is the same methodology that drives his films. So Brandon, you're a co-author on this book, and the two of you have toured together from Los Angeles to New York. You're also a filmmaker, and your projects have earned recognition at festivals, including Palm Springs, Atlanta, New York. And then you happen to have credits on Emmy-nominated series from The Weather Channel, TLC, VH1, and OWN. So welcome. We're really excited to talk with you.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
It's really a pleasure for us too. Yeah. And you're like, I think one of the very few people that I did a pre-interview with, because I just found the subject so interesting, and we're deviating a little bit from what we normally do and yet making it like so perfect for Memoir Nation. So I want to start by cracking open this very interesting theme that we're getting into, which is writing in another voice. And as I said, you're the co-author of this book, Young is Blessed. It was co-authored by you and the author. But the co-authorship is the point here because it's her story, and you could have been a ghostwriter, but you are a co-author. And so tell us a bit about Young's book, and then how you came to be this kind of collaborator as opposed to a more traditional ghostwriter.
Yeah, so I was a producer on Black Ink Crew, story producer. So basically, I helped like write out what the scenes were going to be, like what happens. I don't know if anybody knows, but reality TV really isn't that real. so, so I,
The
I
cat's out of the
know.
bag.
Exactly. So like a lot of times what would happen is I would speak with the cast and we would just go over like, hey, what's happening in your world right now? And you have to take that, translate it into what the story arc is for that actual TV show. So there's like a little bit of reality, but we kind of manipulate it a little bit as well. And I found her stories to be so fascinating because we would just talk about everything that's happening in her normal day to day. And as we filmed more, we got closer and closer, and she started confiding in me in a lot of stuff. And I said, well, has that ever been talked about on the show? And she said, no, they don't want to talk about that. They want to talk about tattoos. They want to talk about my childhood in Korea. And she said she had always wanted to write a book. And then she told me, she's like, I've been through 7 ghostwriters. And I was like, 7 ghostwriters? Why 7? And she said, well, because they are all garbage. And so I said, go ahead and send me just send me a little bit of the manuscript of what they had written. And right out the gate, it is on October 9th, 1984, I came into the world of Seoul, Korea. And I was like, garbage. No, that's not how this works. I was like, you need somebody to write it kind of a little bit like this. So I just quickly text her a paragraph, thinking about how she speaks, listening to her voice. And I sent that to her and she was like, I need you to write this. And I was like, girl, I don't have time to write this. It's not how this works. I was like, but what I could do is I could help you kind of plan it all out. And so what it started out as literally just us talking about her stories and telling me about what happened to her in Korea. I was just jotting down all of these notes and I started seeing a pattern. And that's where I'm a pattern person. And I'm understanding how her life kind of started flowing and getting to the United States, and a story started developing. And I was like, okay, this is non-traditional. Let's kind of see where this goes. Well, when we started talking, we started writing all these stories. Coincidentally, I was going through therapy. And so at the same exact time, she's telling me all of these stories about all of this trauma, and I'm taking it to my therapist. And I'm like, how do I deal with this? And it ended up becoming this very, very collaborative sort of therapy session between the two of us, as she is completely being vulnerable and letting it all out. And I am taking it all in, right? I also knew so much about her, so I was able to pull and extract from her past and say to myself, all right, I think that this could actually be helping to the overall story, right? So that's kind of how it all started. It wasn't transactional in any sense. It just kind of flowed naturally. And then eventually I realized we have enough to go ahead and start writing us a book. And that's how it started.
Well, Brandon, I have to say one of the things that really popped out to me about you, and we're both really interested in when your publicist told us that this idea of writing about things you don't consciously remember writing about. We talked about this before the show, and it's like you go into a kind of a trance. And I've reached flow states in my writing. I've never reached trance states, so I'm super curious. Can you share more about this experience and, when you first remembered doing this kind of writing?
Yeah, as far back as I can remember. It's just something that I've always kind of done. I like to write a lot of notes. So I'm going to give you a case example with Young is Blessed, what ended up happening. So writing everything, taking down notes, right? I had sticky notes all over my apartment. Like, here's this little story. So I chunked them down into stories, right? So it's this story, this one, blah, 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 blah. And then what I do is I will create either a playlist or like a curated playlist, or find an album that conjures up the emotion that I need to write. Like, what makes me feel the feeling that I need in order to achieve this. So with scripts, I usually curate a playlist that kind of plays out the feeling from beginning to end of how I want the narration to go, and finding key songs that help me connect to the actual main character so that I could just play that. And then when I play it, what I do is I bullet point everything out, write my notes, then I'll put on headphones and I'll go into a meditative trance. So I have this meditative practice that I do. I breathe in, I squeeze inside of my body, the lower 3 chakras. This is not a joke, you guys. So I squeeze them and I do it several times, and it kind of shoots up blood to the top of my head and I get a little bit lightheaded. And then I can feel my entire body spinning. And then after it starts spinning, I black out. I just go into like this blank space where nothing is happening. And I'm just listening to the music, and I fall so deeply into the music that all I do is just feel. And it's just the feeling. And my fingers start flying and I just go at it. And hours can pass. I did this a couple weeks ago where I was updating a script and put on my playlist. 13 hours passed by. I had it on repeat. I ended up writing 121 pages in almost a fugue state, in a trance. But then when I come out of it, it is their voice, not mine. So when I first write it out, like in the beats or just kind of like outline whatever I want to write, it sounds like Brandon. I have a very distinct personality and a very distinct writing style. But when I go and I look afterwards, it's not my voice. Like I have then channeled that person's voice. So I become a conduit for them. So with Young specifically, I found Norman Effing Rockwell by Lana Del Rey to be that album. And there's this specific song called Happiness is a Butterfly, and a line in it that really spoke to me about what she was going through. And the line is, if he's a serial killer, then what's the worst that can happen to a girl that's already cursed? And in the book, she ends up meeting her now ex-husband. And it was a toxic relationship from the jump. Like when when she was telling me the stories, I was like, red flags. I'm just like throwing them up everywhere. And it made me think about that. It's like when you're so deeply in love with somebody that all of their faults just fall away. And the idea behind happiness is a butterfly. It is fleeting. It is in the moment. And that was really at the core of what I felt when I was writing that chapter. And then when I was listening to the whole album, I've got goosebumps just right now, just thinking about it. It just brought me emotionally to exactly what I needed to write this book. And I would go in and just write. So in the end, what happened was I had all of these different chapters that we had put together, right? And I rented out a seedy hotel room for like $300 a week kind of thing for 2 weeks. So I had all of these chapters and everything just kind of together. I mean, all over the place. So I went into that hotel room and I listened to Norman King Rockwell on repeat for 2 solid weeks. And I knocked out the entire book. And after I finished writing it, I read it and I don't remember any of it. Like I know that they're my words because they fell out of my fingertips and they came through me, but they're not my words. That sounds like Young Bae speaking.
That's fascinating.
So to me, it was even shocking. And I know I can do that with writing scripts. I go in and I help people write dialogue. That's kind of my thing. So for it to be able to be translated into books, it was super duper helpful that I was able to co-write this and be the ghostwriter and have none of me be present, only be Young Bae. That was amazing. So thanks, Lana Del Rey.
Yes, Lana, if she's part of the story. Absolutely. So, I mean, when you're talking about something like listening on repeat to a song for 2 weeks straight, it's like there is a mental state that you get into. And you told us in advance of the interview that you were diagnosed as a child with something that your doctor described as he's got Asperger's and something else, which is horrifying in modern times, of course, but essentially saying you're neurodivergent, right? And so my curiosity is, like your mom put you in theater because of that. And I guess it's kind of a 2-part question, because now that I'm listening to you talking, it's like you do have a different way of experiencing the world, but theater also opened up like this world of emotions to you. So I was wondering if you could talk about that theater experience and how that's influenced your work.
It's funny because that is a two-part answer, and I'll try to get it as briefly as possible, because this actually started with me requesting to my mother that she allow me to take this speech class to prepare me to go ahead and be able to speak on stage. I was 8 years old, and it was for seniors in high school. And we had to go through all of this red tape for me to go ahead and get accepted. And when I was up on that stage, I created almost this character of myself that was different than what the normal interaction with my fellow students. I tended to be a little bit quicker in learning than everybody else. And so that kind of separated me from the rest of the kids. And I had a really, really hard time connecting with them because I used bigger words. And, I was just very detail oriented, and my interests, I would just bombard people like, oh, I just found out new fact, let me bombard you with that. And my teacher, she was getting really, really sick and tired. Thank you, shout out to Miss Cuba Bizzardi for saving my life, for saving my mom's life. She was like, we got to get this kid into theater, we got to figure out some way to channel his energy and also to learn how to interact better with people. And she thought this would be a great way for him to understand human emotions. Well, as soon as I dove into theater, and as soon as I dive into anything, I've got to learn everything about it. And when I started learning about the different emotions and what they were, it helped me to connect to them in a way that therapy wasn't doing. Like, I was able to look at somebody and say, oh, that's what that emotion is. This is what this emotion is, and then connect it to the feeling inside. So I was able to interact with people a lot better at that point. So that's pretty much where it all started. And then that made me start observing everybody within the world and how we interact with each other. And I think that is what makes me a good producer, and a writer, is that I take in all the different parts. We are not just this, little itty bitty circle condensed down. No, we are the sum total of all the different little pieces that connect us, all of these different stories, all of these interactions that make us who we are. And I find that so fascinating. Theater taught me that. And thank you, Miss Cuba, for introducing it to me, because now I'm able to really, really tap into those emotions. And I think that as a writer, that is the main sauce. That is the key ingredient to the sauce. It is tapping into the emotions, because emotions are universal. So if you can tap into that and you can find words to construct to make somebody feel that way, that's my goal. That's my goal, is to convert the feeling into words so that when people read it or they experience it on screen, it connects with them and it hits them emotionally. And that is where we find our humanity.
Perfectly said. And I love that, tapping into emotions. And it kind of is a nice segue to my question, because you've described writing as a refuge from an abusive home, place to relinquish trauma and recontextualize trauma. And it's very important for that. So I'm curious, when you're writing someone else's trauma, does it still function that way for you? Is it still cathartic, or is it different when it's not your own story?
Fortunately and unfortunately with me, I'm a deeply emotional person, and I feel everybody's feelings. Luckily, I've been in therapy for a very, very long time, so I have a myriad of tools at my disposal to cope with certain situations. I think that it lends itself, the fact that I am really emotional and I do connect deeply with other people's traumas, it can bring up certain things. So, for instance, when I was writing Young is Blessed, there's a lot of physical abuse that happened. And I'm laughing because I wrote this one part about her getting just absolutely just beaten. And I was writing about her thoughts. And she's like, how did you know that those were my thoughts? And I'm like, girl, I've been in this situation too. I know what it's like to cower in fear. I know what the thoughts are that are running through your head when you don't know what to do. You're a child. You have no control in the situation. And so what happens is she's telling me this story, and because of my memory, the way that it operates, it's very emotionally charged. And so when she tells me that, it hits my body in the same exact place where it hit me when I was a child. So I'm reliving it in the moment with her, and I'm feeling it. And I use those feelings to write. And then I have a way to release it afterwards. But it does become cathartic in the sense that not only am I releasing it from myself by writing it out, but I'm helping the other person who is speaking, whose story it is being told. I'm allowing them the opportunity to be vulnerable with me in a safe space so that we can process it together. There is a responsibility, ethical responsibility when it comes to like dealing with trauma and stuff like that. Like working on a new book, and there is a piece of subject matter that I am not familiar with, which is being on the receiving end of domestic violence. And so I can't pull from that, but I can pull from experience of seeing things and also from my childhood abuse. But we started going into talking about the domestic violence and what this person should do. And I was like, that's not in my wheelhouse. What I can do is point you in the right direction to get the right therapy, but I'm going to probably have to deal with some therapy on my own to know how to deal with that situation, even though it's not mine. Because once I start feeling an emotion, it becomes mine. And so I have ways to deal with it, but
I'm curious, and like it might be too personal, but when you say that you have ways of releasing it, I mean, is that just therapy, or is there something for writers that you can recommend that has worked for you? Because people do look for that release.
Yes. One thing, and people are going to hate me for saying this, running. I know it sounds terrible. It's horrible.
You hate every minute.
You do. Like once you get into that flow state and you get past it, your brain starts clearing. So that's one. Two, I mean, it's cliche. Just write it down. Another really good thing too, it's about expulsion. Like you have to get it out. There's modality. You have to have movement with it too, because if not, it just stays stagnant within your body. So that is, sometimes I'll just record myself talking about things. That helps out. I do a lot of meditating, but a lot of people aren't really great at getting into meditating. I've been doing it since the beginning of 2006. So I guess I'm on year 20 now. And it's only been in the past maybe 3 years that I've actually had a decent meditative practice where I do it every single night. Not everybody has that capability. So I can't say to another writer, yeah, just go into meditation for 30 minutes. That'll help. I think writing it out, speaking it out definitely helps. So even if you do it to your phone, you're recording it, you can go back and look at it because you can then learn from what you just told yourself.
Right. Really helpful. Thank you. I was just looking for something concrete. So I love that.
Yeah.
Most ghostwriting relationships start with a contract. Yours started with knowing Young. You guys had years of conversation. You just said you knew her voice. So it just made me wonder if you could have done this kind of collaboration if you hadn't known her to the depth that you do. And are you going to take on more, like if you took on another ghostwriting project, would it be more traditional ghostwriting, or do you think that this kind of like collaboration is just your thing?
It is 100% my thing. So, going back to the reality TV, just being a producer and a writer for that, I actually had to write a lot for these people. So like whenever they do their green screen interviews, when they're talking directly at the camera, right? So, so I was sitting there today and he had the nerve to come up to me and say that. Well, I have to write that. And then we'll put it like on a teleprompter, so they can read it, but I have to write it in their voice.
Not even that is spontaneous. Come on.
Yeah, no, it's really, there's sometimes that it is, sometimes that it's not. But like getting into somebody's head, that has always been my thing. So writing for commercials, writing for movies, getting into characters. This is my first time writing a memoir for somebody. I'm actually in the process of writing a next book. I don't know how much I could talk about it, but it is from the perspective of Estelle Getty's personal assistant.
Interesting.
And what it was, it is so fascinating. It's about all of from the time of Golden Girls right up to the end of her life, the stories that he has. And he's a character. It doesn't sound anything like me, but it is really, I have to get into the groove with a person and understand who they are. And I think that with Young Bae, because I had already known her, because we had worked together, that really lent to the ease of the flow. But I do have the capability of doing that with just about anybody. It really is just me understanding who they are as a person. And then once I figured that out and I can hear the way that they speak, their cadence, everything about it, then I can go into my little trance and write. And then the collaboration really comes when I send that version back to them and they look it over and they're like, oh, I would say it exactly like this. Change this one word because I wouldn't say that word. That's where the real collaboration comes in. So it really doesn't matter. As long as I get to know them a little bit, I can tap into figuring out who they are and write in their own style. It's a weird thing to do, but I guess it's an anomaly. I really don't know. It's just how I write. I thought that everybody does this, but I guess not.
No, it's been completely enlightening, Brandon. In fact, I'm sitting here thinking, wow, I wish I could be in your head for just a single hour to know how this
nobody
all
wants
really
to
works.
do that. I promise you. You get in there, it's like a house of mirrors. You're just like,
yeah,
where
that
am
sounds
I?
interesting too. Well, yeah, I mean, and that is my question. Is that just your neurodivergence. You've talked about how that makes you better at this kind of deep character work, which I'm fascinated by. And so, how might you recommend people who are neurotypical, try to deepen this connection with these kinds of emotions or skill sets or whatever you might refer to this as?
Yeah. So I think one of the things about neurodivergence, we're pattern recognizers. So that to me is kind of like the start of it, right? And people that aren't neurodivergent, they don't see all of the different patterns that we see in the world, right? So what I think, because your question is really about like how can somebody like me as a writer, reach out and connect better with people who aren't at neurodivergent so they can develop these skill sets. Am I correct? That's kind of the...
It's kind of like you have a superpower.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is we tend to not pay attention to anybody but ourselves. When we're having conversations, we're always thinking about the next thing that we're going to say, or how we're going to respond to certain things. Whereas when you are neurodivergent, you're constantly looking at the world at how they are perceiving you or how you're being perceived. And we have become so accustomed to masking ourselves that we move through the world and try to figure out how we find our place. And in that, we are observing everything. We're observing your moves. We're observing your speech pattern. We're observing the way that you operate within the world. And we also try to understand your emotions. A lot of neurodivergent people, they're very, very emotional. They're overly emotional. It's just we don't have the context to understand or put a name or a word or a label with it because our emotions pop up in different ways versus neurotypical people. So I think one of the good things to learn from somebody who is neurodivergent that is tapping into those emotions is the fact that we all have those emotions and we all have the same capability to tap into them. I think a lot of people are extremely afraid to tap into those emotions to see what they're going to find. Neurodivergent people tend to be curious by nature. And so whenever there is fear in our curiosity, we tend to push it off to the side because we know what we need to fear. And our emotions aren't those things that we need to fear. And I think that being vulnerable in the way that we can be and expressing those emotions, whether they're through writing or through painting, drawing, filmmaking, that's how we express it. For non-neurodivergent people, take that, learn from it, absorb it, pay attention, find yourself in that. Allow yourself a moment to sit in the feeling, to sit in and read the book and look between the lines. What is it that we're trying to tell you? What is it that we're trying to evoke from you emotionally? That is where we are. So, we all have all of these emotional stories and histories to tell. And what I'm hoping is that somebody like me who is not afraid to dive deep into those emotions and convey that to people, that I can bridge that gap and help people connect in a more humane way because we all have beautiful stories to tell.
My gosh, look at that. It was like a Hallmark ending there for us with all that TV experience. Thank you, Brandon. And that's what I wanted you to get into with our listeners. It's just like this emotional capacity that you have and just cultivating it. So thanks for speaking to that. We certainly appreciate you coming on.
Oh, thank you both so much. I really do appreciate it.
Absolutely. I fell into a trance listening to you, Brandon. So thank you. A good trance.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you
and congratulations to you and Young. And hey, so Lana.
Hey, Lana.
Yeah, hello, Lana. Thanks for listening. Thanks for listening.
We'll be right back with today's book trend. So, Grant, I was at the annual Independent Book Publishers Association conference earlier this month, and I wanted to share a positive trend coming out of that, and that is the rise in awareness and popularity of a brand new bestseller list. This is kind of a big deal. It's called the Independent Press Top 40, and it's a weekly bestseller list run by the Independent Publishers Caucus. It's produced in partnership with the American Booksellers Association. It tracks top-selling titles from indie presses as represented at indie bookstores across the U.S., and it publishes a fiction and a nonfiction list. And publishers at the conference were really buzzing about it because finally here is a bestseller list that is not being dominated by the big five. It's exclusively indie, and it shines light on some performing books that we might not otherwise know about because of the way that the New York Times kind of has some problems.
Yeah, I'm super excited to hear about this. I think I'm likely to become addicted to checking this list out every week and seeing what's there, because there are going to be new books on it, right? It's going to be a fantastic discovery tool. And I heard that this list got announced at, the Winter Institute this year, just this past February. And it's a pretty ambitious thing to do also, to try to compete with lists like the New York Times and USA Today. So, Brooke, what kinds of presses qualify for their books to be on the Independent Press Top 40 list? I'm curious if my publishers will fit in there. And, is it just any publisher that's not a Big Five publisher?
I think so. The Independent Publisher Caucus basically defines an independent publisher as a publisher of books with a publisher with no more than 60 employees. And you'd have to have a minimum of 10 books in print by no less than 3 authors. So what they're trying to do there, of course, is exclude self-publishers. I don't think like maliciously, but, it's indie presses, and they need to be, actually it says they can't be fully owned imprints at major houses. So basically it's a size-based definition, indie presses.
Yeah. So I'm thinking She Writes Press qualifies, unless you've done a lot of hiring recently. And,
like we have 70 employees.
Yeah. And, so I hope you'll get one of your books on this list someday, Brooke. And I know you're a member of IPC. And if I can just pause and be a little self-centered myself, I hope one of my future indie books also might make it. And
Absolutely.
The only list like this that I experienced was the old small press Traffic. They used to do a small press bestseller list. I have no idea how they configured that, but this sounds much more ambitious and exciting. So tell me more about the association, what they're doing for publishers.
Yeah, IPC is not actually that old themselves, and there are a lot of member benefits. You do have to be a publisher. It's a publishers association, and so they do community stuff in the form of town halls and small groups. They do marketing and sales. That's what this bestseller list falls under. They do events. They're involved in an indie press summit at Winter Institute, and then they have a strong presence at ALA, which is the American Library Association, and I'm going to be there next month in June. They do business support and advocacy. So, robust offerings for sure. But the bestseller list is just really smart because a lot of publishers, not wrongly, by the way, think that the New York Times and the USA Today bestseller list can be bought. And so that's something that's infuriating for some people, annoying for others. But, the lists also lose their credibility when people game the system.
Completely, yeah. Very few people know that, but I know it's been under question for a long time. So please explain, how do authors or publishers do that? How do they game the system to buy spots on that list?
It's because it's about volume of sales through certain channels, which, by the way, like are not very transparent. And so, there are ways to do it, although it's not some kind of formula. And so like the way I think it happens is that if you have bookstore relationships across the country, and then on pub week or on a given week, you push through a certain number of book sales through those sales channels, right? Through bookstores. And so it spikes your numbers. So just to explain how that works, like let's just imagine I publish my memoir. I myself purchase hundreds and hundreds of copies, but I place those orders strategically through various bookstores across the country. They're counting as sales, but the bookstores aren't selling them. I'm coming and picking them up, right? And so bookstores are incentivized to participate in schemes like these because they're sales, but it does make you feel a bit suspect, right? Because it's the publishers who are driving it. And then there's just like an air of disappointment to the whole bestseller list, which I think is why IPC is trying to do this indie one.
Yeah, totally exciting, but it's horrifying that people are gaming the lists like that. And just as you were saying that, I was like, wow, this obviously caters to the privileged, those with money and access, and started to think like, oh, these are the same people who bribe admissions officers at colleges to get their underperforming kids in. It's kind of the same thing. And, just disappointing that there's nothing sacred anymore. But definitely want to commend IPC for trying to put their mark on this space and elevate indie authors, of course. And I hope that this list will get a lot of traction. It sounds like it already is. Like I said, I'm going to be addicted to checking it out.
You'll let us know.
Yeah. And I know we both follow Kathleen Schmidt on Substack and admire her. And she writes a newsletter called Publishing Confidential, and she's often criticizing the New York Times bestseller list. So is this what's behind her criticism?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, she is posting about it a lot, and I can sum up her arguments in a few points. And certainly she's a publicist, and so I can understand. I mean, I'm very frustrated by the whole thing as a publisher, but she argues about the New York Times. It lacks transparency. The list lacks transparency because they don't disclose how they compile the data. She has called it a racket, mostly because it's just not consistently tied to sales in the way that it should be. And then she also argues that it's inequitable. And that ties back to transparency, because until we know what data is being used to track the list, then it's like, well, who are they favoring and why? About the gaming of the list, and the fact that there exist all these companies out there that do charge thousands of dollars to buy books in bulk, right? Like what we're talking about. And then they're essentially manufacturing bestseller status. And in one piece, by way of example, she talked about how politicians have used their PACs to buy books in bulk. And it's to like avoid the embarrassment of missing the bestseller list. So super annoying, obviously. And then finally, self-published books don't qualify, and they don't qualify for the IPC list either. So, I mean, this is sort of down the equity list problem, but even still, you have genre authors like romance and thriller authors who are self-publishing, and they're having incredible sales, and they just can't even be considered for these lists.
Yeah, that's really weird. It really warps our notions of what's selling and what's popular. And that's a lot of critique, of course, and it's all very valid. So no wonder that Kathleen is on a tear about it. And I love that the IPC was in the position to do something about this, and that you're saying it was getting a lot of buzz, and the Publishing University conference you attended. So listeners, you can check out the bestseller list. I'm going to be there in about 5 minutes. It's at www, of course, indiepubs, that's INDIE, pubs.org, /top 40. And it's also being published each week on Bookshop and bookmanager.com. Like I said, I can't wait to look at it. It's going to be super fun, to see indies on the list that are familiar, and some of them probably not. And just to see what books are out there, knowing that these books are, they're actually being sold in ways that are transparently accounted for, no rigging the system. Imagine that. I always say that the most interesting books, I know Brooke thinks this too, are being published by indie publishers. I am just weren't so sure of this. And this is obviously a great way to give them more visibility. So thanks for listening, everyone. And thanks for leaving comments and inviting your friends to listen and celebrating our 400th episode with us recently. I was just so touched by listeners' comments online. And we hope to be with you for another 400 episodes. I don't know if Brooke's going to commit to that quite yet, but let's go for the next 100 maybe. So thanks for giving us the oomph and the energy and the love to keep going.